So I thought I'd talk a little bit about some things I've seen in the past year since I was on a panel with David and Christian and Rick Anderson in Vancouver, and also a panel that I led at STM that Craig was kind enough to participate in, along with Don Hamparian from OCLC, who's an important player in this. And actually next week, Don and I will be on a panel at NASIG with Richard Guajardo as the moderator. And so if you want to see slideware from me, you have to go to that meeting. But a couple of things that I've been noticing, I basically every day I'm looking at some reporting that we put out at Elsevier for internal use to see what kind of activity is taking place that looks like bots. And we have an algorithm that we've set up that identifies that, and there's a report that comes out of our usage system every morning that I look at, and then I do some deeper dives into that usage and make decisions about how to manage that. Do I turn off an IP? Do I just ask the customer to look into it? Do I think it's benign, but for some reason, you know, maybe it's quote unquote legitimate in a way that is maybe we hadn't thought of at one point. So for instance, a good example of that is that folks are using EndNote a lot now to actually download articles. So you build a corpus of references, and then you say, well, I want those articles. So Bing, push a button, and you get several hundred to several thousands of articles. I think we have to decide, we haven't really quite decided yet how we deal with that. We would really, at Elsevier, we would really prefer that they use our text data mining API to get that information. So, you know, those are the kinds of decisions I'm looking at, and that I take, and then I reach out to customers with reports, detailed report, log files that give them better information so that they can search their logs to try to find the user. And for the most part, I mean, unfortunately, most of the usage that we see is coming from people that I call bad guys who have gained access to the university's network. And when we talked about IP authentication, it really isn't authentication at all, is it? It's just access. An IP is put into a university, or a customer says, these are the IPs that are associated with our institution, our company, and we put them into our A&E system, and then anybody who's sitting on those IPs or has access to those IPs can get access to ScienceDirect or Scopus or whatever. Now, and that gets particularly challenging. One situation we had recently was that a corporate customer gave us 6 IP addresses, and they were actually in fairly large CEDAR ranges for Time Warner or Comcast, Verizon, for 6 employees who were going to access from home. Now, they never should have given us that, and we never should have accepted it. Fortunately, one of our sales coordinators saw that that was wrong. Another thing that I've noticed lately that's really of concern to me is that in China, a lot of the customers have, in addition to sitting on the CERNET backbone, which is the Chinese Educational Resources Network that was set up when the Chinese universities started accessing publisher content, maybe, 20 years ago practically. A lot of them are now also setting up VPNs using Chinese ISPs. Now, those ISPs are also responsible for tremendous amounts of content theft activity, or what I think is content theft activity, because I see those IPs coming into our guest account and downloading hundreds to thousands of copies of articles. And so, then when you see activity coming through those VPN IPs, you notice, if you do a Whois lookup, you notice that they're associated with China Unicom or some other ISP, and you have to wonder, who is really getting access to those. Another area that, you know, publishers should be looking at, and libraries also, is that one thing, there are a number of sites that are selling login credentials. You see this in China, you see it in Iran, you see it in other places, but they advertise, you know, for $2 a login that gives you access to Science Direct, or to ProQuest, or to Scopus, or to Wiley Online Library, IEEE. And so these are where they've done the phishing, I want to say exhibition, but that's not the right word. Expedition. Which are really quite clever, often quite clever. One of the libraries in Germany sent me a copy of an email that had circulated amongst their community, where the fishers were, I don't know if clever isn't the right word, but they had the chutzpah to put a copyright notice for the library at the bottom of the email. It said copyright 2017, blah, 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 Universität. So they're very clever, and people aren't smart enough to not respond to them. And then, of course, there's also sharing, which was referenced earlier, where people have actually just feel, okay, I'll share my user credentials. And one of the points Rick Anderson has made in both on the Scholarly Kitchen and at the meeting last year is that, you know, be careful about that, because of course this is your username and password that's used for all of your institutional access, including your 401k plan, or it wouldn't be a 401k plan, your TIAA CREF account, or your health coverage, or what have you. So then early this year, we noticed huge amounts of downloading coming through some US and Canadian universities from ISPs in Iran, and also in traffic that was being routed from Iran into Germany and then into Science Direct. And my hunch is that was being used to build a corpus of information on a couple of sites. One is called DanishkoStar.com, and the other is called IranPaper.ir. So these are sites in Iran that are selling content for, you know, the equivalent of $2 an article or something like that. So, and then blocking those guys is really quite difficult, because it's hard to, it really has to be blocked almost at the university side, because they're gaining access to the university, then coming to us through a proxy. So we're not seeing that original IP unless the customer provides us with that IP, and then by then it's too late anyway. You know, of course, we can block the customer's IP, but of course that it's often a proxy address, and then huge amounts of the community are blocked until it gets sorted out. Of course, what can be done then is better security can be done on the proxy side. And you know, what I noticed too is that there are universities that are consistently whose systems are consistently breached, and I see downloading coming from all the time, and others where it never happens at all. And the University of Toronto, for example, is a very good example of where they've built up very, very good security over the years, because they've been locally hosting content from publishers, again, since 96, 97, when all of us started to provide data for local loads. And I had a conversation with them once in which they told me how much care they take in doing this. So it's quite interesting to see. We, of course, see a lot of activity from China, a lot of activity from Iran lately, some from Southeast Asia. It kind of comes and goes there. India is also another spot where where there's a lot of high usage, where, you know, it's also a situation where, is it really rogue usage, or is it, again, and as one librarian said to me, an enthusiastic user of Elsevier content? And that could apply to all of you, who are publishers. So I'm really hoping that, for a couple of things. One is that we at Elsevier get better at putting some technology into place, or we have the technology, we're just fine-tuning it, that actually can block sessions rather than IPs. So if we see certain types of bot activity, that session can be blocked, but other users of IP, x.x.x.x won't be blocked, and it takes place for a short period of time rather than an extended period of time while the issue has to be sorted out. And the other is that I'm trying to, as part of the RA21 initiative last year, I was involved in that in the first phase, and then I was asked to. A group of us are also looking into an IP authentication database, and we're talking to a couple of vendors about that. But we also were asked to try to build up some kind of guidebook that we can provide to publishers. So, sorry, not to publishers, but to customers, to help them navigate this problem on their end. And I hope we can get that, we can pick that up again in the second half of this year, because I do think there's a huge amount of education needed, particularly in developing countries. You find that with North American, Japanese, and European customers, if I reach out to them with a problem, typically it's sorted within 24 to 48 hours. Typically you get a response right away saying, oh, okay, thank you, we're going to look into this, we're sending it to our IT security folks, or we need, can you provide us with a little bit more information? And then shortly thereafter there's a response that says, yes, we found this, please, here's the details, please restore access. But in some of the other countries, they really struggle to figure out what's going on, and they need a lot of support in learning how to deal with those situations. So I think that's, oh yeah, the one other thing, the Sci-Hub issue, it seems to me that one area where publishers need to be careful and be more alert is that there's probably a lot of Sci-Hub usage going on at a very low level. In other words, a very low usage level. So rather than hundreds and thousands of articles being downloaded at one time, you're probably talking about 3 or 4 or 5, because of course the Sci-Hub model is that if it's not in their database, then they grab a username and password that they have for an institution and go out to Science Direct or to Wiley or to Springer or TNF or IEEE or whoever, and then grab the article that they're looking for, and then it gets put into the LiveGen database. At least that's my understanding of how it works. And some publishers have been able to start to track that very low level usage and identify that this is coming from Sci-Hub. They've built some algorithms and some tracking tools where they can hitch a ride on a search, and then they're acting in different ways with the libraries to either block that access until it's fixed or notify them or what have you. And so I think that that's also an area that really, as we see more and more, Sci-Hub's got to keep, they've done, I think most of the damage has been done in that they clearly, we know they probably have 99% of our articles, but they have to keep, we're adding hundreds of thousands of articles a year. Well, they have to keep filling they're like an addict. They have to keep filling the coffers there, their database there. So they're figuring out clever ways to get that information. So.
Have any formal remarks prepared, but some things have definitely occurred to me as I've been listening to the other folks here. So I think Northeastern is typical of many North American universities in that we have single sign-on, we have Shibboleth authentication, and that provides access to not only all of our licensed e-resources, but students' grades, their social security number, their anybody's pay stub information for faculty and staff. So you know, the risk for security breach is very high. And unfortunately, our ITS, our Information Technology Services Division, does not seem to be doing a very good job, in my opinion, of directly addressing Sci-Hub. I was trying to find it on their website while others were speaking. I remember they'd send out these quarterly information security newsletters. And I remember that Sci-Hub was mentioned very briefly in one of them a couple of newsletters ago, and I couldn't find it. I searched our university website. There's no mention of Sci-Hub. There are sort of these very generic cautions about phishing scams, you know, that are sent out regularly. Not to give your username and password to people or any personal information, but I think those warnings are like wallpaper at this point. You don't even notice them. Yeah, phishing. Don't give your password out. But you know, as you were saying, I think some of these phishers are pretty talented in making their attempts look like they're coming from the university. And it only takes, you know, for Sci-Hub, for example, they don't need access to everybody's username and password. They need one person to respond to the phishing attempt, and then they have access to everything that we subscribe to. So I do think that that's, you know, a concern. And I also, you know, was thinking back to the presentation about the science study that showed that 88% of the respondents didn't think that it was wrong to download papers from a pirated site. I think there are a lot of faculty and definitely students who would agree with that as well. The only context that I have heard Sci-Hub mentioned by a student is we did a screening of the documentary about Aaron Swartz last year, and Sci-Hub was mentioned in that context. So, excuse me, I think there is a certain, like, you know, not Alexandra Elbkayan, you know, kind of portrays herself as a hero, as a Robin Hood of this field, and I think there is perhaps a tendency among people who haven't really thought about this in terms of copyright protection to lionize the efforts of Sci-Hub and pirates, and to consider them in the same context as Aaron Swartz, who has been portrayed as kind of a tragic hero. And I think in libraries we have a duty to do better in distinguishing things there.
A quick response to that. I think that it's interesting, the comment about all these usernames and passwords being tied to more personally identifiable things that actually have value to the user. I think this is, in our discussions, this has been one of the big values in moving away from IP as an entrance mechanism, because now you're giving even people who have advocacy reasons for for giving up their credentials now have less or more incentive to protect them, because now it's getting closer to their own content. So there is the belief that tying access to content to an individual makes them something that's used for other accesses, makes them less inclined to give it up for advocacy reasons. And then secondly, there's also an interesting there's a strong move towards second factor authentication, something you have as well as something you know, which means that the username and password becomes mostly useless or partially useless in cases of phishing. I'm interested to see if academic institutions take this up. Corporations have taken it up, but I don't know that academics have gotten quite as close.
Yeah, a few are. I think, you know, it's difficult to scale in some cases when you have tens of thousands of people to manage two-factor authentication for. Also, in the case of logging in to access e-resources, our users see that as a bug. It's not a feature, you know, and that's why one of the reasons why sites like Sci-Hub exist. You know, it's not just people in developing countries that are using Sci-Hub. Lots of people in North America, you know, who are, you know, affiliated with institutions that have subscription access to these resources are choosing to go to Sci-Hub because it's easier. We hear that from people. So, you know, if we are going to go to two-factor authentication, I totally agree with you that it needs to be made personal and not just like we need to protect this stuff that costs us a lot of money, because our users don't, I mean, they might care about that in a theoretical sense, but when it comes if they can get what they need by not logging in and jumping through the hoops, they will. But if it's about protecting their pay stub or their grades or their, personal information, I think that matters more to them.
And then, of course, doing it in a way that doesn't expose all of their research habits and sell them to
Right.
Facebook and others. Yeah. So,
So I'm going to open it up for conversation. We have some time. Please.
May I just piggyback on the Sci-Hub thing again? And I've thought about and talked with a lot of people. Some people say I have a suspicious mind. If I was Russia and hacking, and I wanted to get in every institution's server around the world, including government institutions, the FDA, everywhere, what would I do? I'd give away free reprints. And is there any evidence to the contrary? Because we've had this experience and we're all thinking content, but is there something much more malicious going on? And I just throw that out.
That's a good question. I don't think anyone really knows for sure, but if I was to take to our software development teams and our IT teams and said, I want to host 60, 70 million articles for around the world access for immediate download, that would be a big bill. And the bandwidth to serve that up would also be a big bill. So the likelihood that this is coming from Bitcoin donations seems unlikely to me.
So I think one of the challenges, or one of the perceived challenges in this tug of war, as Dan mentioned, between privacy and access and authentication, is this notion that you can have one or the other. And I think this is one of the inaccuracies, I think, in the moment, in the public perception about this. More secure authentication doesn't necessarily mean that you live in an environment where everything you do can be tracked. So does anybody have any thoughts or comments on that? Sure. Dan?
Sure, I think that it's, they're through conscious decisions about giving access as a gate, which is really what access is. It's the key to open the gate. And designing systems that are built upon not infringing on people's privacy and giving them easy ways to get in and giving them, making it as frictionless as possible to enable them to want to come in, and then also giving them value for doing so. To the comment earlier about making them want to come this path. I think giving value that is not given in Sci-Hub or other situations is also key to doing so. But you're right, there's this continuum from fully closed to fully open and freely available, and making conscious decisions about where it makes sense to make closure and where it makes sense to be open, and doing it in a way that keeps the researcher in mind is always can give you the best of both worlds.
And another, I think one of the, and this is something that Judy Luther and I are kind of working on a draft for the Scully Kitchen, that piracy, from all of the things we've heard here, piracy is a symptom of a failing authentication system. That the customer service that publishers are providing is failing. I mean, I think in Michael and Jason's presentation, where they cited, what, 51% as using Sci-Hub for convenience, because there's a perception that it works. And I'm sure 51% of the 11,000 scholars that were surveyed had access in some fashion. And so I'd be interested to hear from you, Michael, Jason, and Hillary, how can the publishing community improve the user experience? I mean, IP authentication, with all of its problems, should be pretty easy. It's full of holes, and it's still not easy enough. What can we, the publishing community, the library community, what can we do to improve that user experience so that the easy alternative going to Sci-Hub isn't the easiest option? Is there anything that we could do?
One answer I've heard, sort of a glibbish response, is that, paywalls themselves are the problem. And that if we move to an open access world, or we move to a world where all of this content is freely accessible, then we solve a lot of these problems. It clearly is not that simple. I'm not suggesting that it is, or necessarily that is a good answer, but I do know among folks in consortia land who think about these things, that's the answer. Not, keeping it easy or, all that, but just make them go away absolutely, because this is about not having them. That's one view.
Wasn't your study of the 300 articles, weren't they open access articles?
No.
No, they didn't.
We should have, the last part was referring directly to a set of open access articles, but the 300 that we studied were randomly chosen in order to allow us to determine what proportion were openly available. And so we found that 55% were freely available through conventional means, and 90% were available via unconventional, or via Sci-Hub. Yeah. So that's one response, but I bet other folks have an answer to that question. What can the publishing community do?
I mean, I don't have an answer either, other than make it all freely available, or get rid of paywalls, right? Which I'm not necessarily advocating for, because it's not as simple as that. But if it were as easy as Google Scholar or Google, and so this is not just about, it's not just about content, it's about our discovery systems as well, right? If it were as easy and if it was easy to use as Google and Google Scholar, we wouldn't have a problem.
I think there's also an element of completeness, though. The notion that 267 of 300 were available in one easy-to-go place. So it's facilitation of ease, but it's also completeness of scope. I don't want to have to go to 4 different places and piece together myself. To your comment about the completeness of discovery systems, I think that is on top of the ease of a single googly bar that Sci-Hub has. I go to one place and I get just about everything I could ever need, as the research shows.
Yeah, and I think to tie in with the discovery system topic, I think an area where publishers can help is through platform neutrality support. So, our discovery system, like many, does not provide a complete list of everything that we subscribe to unless our user signs in to the discovery system. And that is determined by the publisher or the provider of the content, who doesn't want their content, even at the bibliographic record level, to be exposed without the user signing in to the discovery system. That is not helping things. Because if our users know that they can get access, not just to the bibliographic record, where they then have to click and then click again and then click again to get to the full text, if they can just go to Google or Google Scholar and find everything that they're looking for, or most of the things that they're looking for, they're going to do that. One thing about Sci-Hub that hasn't been mentioned is you can't just do free text searching in Sci-Hub. You have to look up a DOI or something like that. So it's not, you have to be a little bit of a savvy user to get the full advantage out of Sci-Hub. So I think publishers have that going for them. Sci-Hub is not Google. And so, there is, I think, an opportunity there for publishers and content providers and vendors and discovery system people and libraries to all, work together somehow to, we just need to prove our value. We have to prove to users in a way that we're not currently doing that signing in is worth it, that you're going to get more functionality, you're going to get more security for yourself, and that you are then supporting the content providers. That is, I think, a challenging argument to make sometimes, but it's important that they hear it and start hearing it from day one of their academic careers. Not necessarily, authors tend to care more perhaps about their content being shared. Some do, some don't actually, but students don't have any horse in that race, so to speak. So, yeah, collaboration, I guess I would say.
I just want to add one thing, and Jason mentioned this before, but there's the Sci-Hub plugin that allows you to search Google Scholar and get Sci-Hub as the result. So the native Sci-Hub is not as easy, but if you set this up basically when you search Google Scholar, so you get this great discovery system and you get all the content. Works wonderfully.
I would follow on there that in the early days of Sci-Hub, you actually could put keywords in because it was proxying into Google Scholar, and then that was closed out by Google at some point. The other thing I would say about this notion of friction is that if you were to break down Sci-Hub usage a little more granularly and saying the researcher sitting on campus with IP authentication with a subscription to an article is probably not going to start at Sci-Hub, right? Because they have that frictionless experience. But when you start adding layers on top of that, either you hit paywalls or you're off campus or you have to VPN in or you need a discovery service that's got multiple different vectors, each one of those is more friction for that user, and at some point they throw up their hands and say, okay, I'm just going to go for the easy route here, not the honorable route, but I need to get my job done here. And so Roger Schoenweld's talk about this a couple of years ago got this whole thing into the radar, I think, of the industry, and certainly mine as well. And those layers of friction have to be really very carefully thought about as we build institutional systems and as platform systems and as publishing systems, because each one of those layers drives that user away.
Certainly, and I was going to say that if reducing friction ends up happening automatically because institutions require single sign-on or even two-factor authentication as a matter of course for accessing the network, right? If it gets to that level, which it might, then this problem is solved, more or less. USC, University of Southern California, is already using two-factor authentication to log into many of its systems. Now, if that's in any way associated with getting access to content, that's where the friction related to library content comes from, and that's really bad. But it does seem to me that one possible path, which it may or may not happen and we can only have so much influence over, is institutions doing that as a matter of course, and then a lot of at least that piece of it could be taken care of.
Well, I think realistically, more and more institutions are going to look at security breaches and the fact that they're going to have to pull these things down, lock their systems down for other reasons.
Right.
Maybe they might not be as concerned about the access to the library, but they're certainly concerned about access to their students' records or their payroll system, et cetera, et cetera. Right. That as a blanket statement, every interaction on this network is going to be secure. I think we're headed more and more in that direction, not only just within an institutional context, I think writ large on the internet.
Well, it's also compounded by the fact that the notion of the internal network is disappearing at libraries, at companies, as we're using more service providers, Office 365 and other things. The notion of this protected internal network doesn't exist. So this is also forcing the move for two-factor authentication for HR systems, for grade systems, et cetera, which we can be beneficiaries of. Like I said, as it crosses that critical mass and it's there, it's an infrastructure that we can have the librarians help us plug into. But one of the keys there is bridging a gap between, it seems to exist between libraries and the IT staffs at the institutions. And I think it behooves us to help either bridge that or inform or find ways to lessen what has been Hillary, help me, correct me if I'm wrong, but it has been a historically large gap.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you. Listen, I just have one comment. Maybe my English is not good enough to understand everything, but to be clear, are you trying to, publishers, will you try to stop Sci-Hub, or do we have to consider that now Sci-Hub is part of the landscape for a long time? And to my knowledge, it's Elsevier who tried to make some attempt to stop and reduce the usage of Sci-Hub, because in my country, in Paris, for example, you have one of the largest groups of hospitals, APHP, reduce massively their subscription to journals because they thought it was too expensive, whatever. And I think they know, of course, what people are doing. You know, you cannot access Sci-Hub from an IP address from APHP, but everybody has a laptop and they do download Sci-Hub from the personal laptop, and this is quite known. So my question is, will we have Sci-Hub in 2 years' time, 3 years' time? Is it part of the landscape, or will you try to kill this website?
There's a suit right now.
Sorry? And yes?
Sorry, go ahead.
Thank you. I don't know much about it, but there's evidently we filed a suit, a damages suit against Sci-Hub, and there's been other legal action against Sci-Hub as well, which led to the Google. You were mentioning the Google Scholar to Sci-Hub, and due to various legal actions that have been taken, then Google stopped doing that. But it's hard to. My personal opinion, it's hard. I mean, hopefully it'll go away, but I think it's very difficult. If you look at the live license, well, I don't think you even need to look at live. There's Torrent Freak, is that the website? Yeah. So if you look at the Torrent Freak website, evidently the details of the suit have been published there. I wasn't aware of it until I saw it mentioned on the live license listserv. But we have, and I don't know if there are other parties who are with Elsevier, or if it's just Elsevier. But certainly we're trying to close them down. But
how many at the table would be surprised if Sci-Hub was shut down within 2 to 3 years? Surprised if it was shut down. Yeah. It's going to be around a long time, I think, no matter what efforts are made to shut it down.
That's hard.
I think content is out there as well.
Right.
Yeah, I think there's no getting back 60 million articles at this point, but, you know, per the study that Michael showed earlier, because there's so much penetration in terms of accessibility to any content, anywhere, via Sci-Hub, that's one of its main drivers. So these efforts to improve with single sign-on and sort of get the ecosystem a little more tied down means that there'll be more misses when people search on Sci-Hub, and maybe at some point the experience will be degraded to the point where it's not a go-to place anymore. It gets dated, it gets stale, things like that, and then it will wither at that point a bit.
Well, you got to get everybody on board before there's a lot of that effect, right? So as long as there's universities, institutions out there that aren't securing things, which is going to happen because there's a lot of them out there and they're little.
Yeah.
Yeah,
that's a big task.
But
I have a question for the librarians. Are you seeing a marked decrease in usage of subscribed content in the last 2 or 3 years? From the publisher usage reports?
That's not part of my area of responsibility, so I don't monitor the usage, but I haven't heard that. I spoke with a colleague not too long ago at a different university who said that they had looked into accesses of Sci-Hub at their institution and compared it to their usage stats that they get from the content providers and hadn't noticed, any kind of negative correlation. So, I mean, I think it's impossible to say, and I would imagine it also has to do with, the amount of stuff you subscribe to and what people, it's difficult to know what people are accessing by institution on Sci-Hub. So I think it's, if Sci-Hub would give us usage statistics, that would be actually very interesting. If anybody knows Alexandra, let her know that. I mean, if our users are using it, we want to know how they're using it. And right now, we just don't have a good sense of that.
I did have a conversation with an industry expert who said it's very hard to make a case for financial damage to the major publishers coming from Sci-Hub, that there isn't enough evidence that that usage is dropping and that cancellations are happening related to that to actually make for much of a legal approach, actually.
Okay. One last question?
And I think that's what my question stemmed from, is what do we perceive the urgency to be to protect or to watch and garner against the loss of traditional revenue streams for the publishers? I understand, I'm sitting back there and it is a big tug of war. I'm here, I'm there, I'm hearing everything. But then at the end of the day, what's the gap between what we see the pirates and the Sci-Hubs and everybody else starting to do, and they're doing more sophisticated methodologies now, before we start to see, as a publisher, I'm sorry, I'm Leslie Walker with the ACS, American Chemical Society, and before we start to see that ingress into our revenue streams. I don't feel the urgency from the conversation at a high pitch right now. I feel that it's definitely a topic and we all need to kind of wrap our heads around it and see where we go, but what's the urgency before we start to see it really dip into the loss of subscriptions or the loss of revenue streams?
There was a part of that Nature article, and I don't have the number, that talked about how many people access Sci-Hub from places that already had the access. And I think that number is important to this discussion. I don't have an answer as to when or how much, but I think that's an important piece as that number shrinks and the number of general users using Sci-Hub grows. If that happens, I think that's where your inflection point is for this.
One quick comment?
Okay, I don't know how quick I can make this. Publishers for a very long time have congratulated ourselves for participating in Research for Life and giving our content for free, which is a great thing. However, one of the things we haven't looked at is the user experience for Research for Life, which honestly is terrible. The content may as well not have been accessible at all. And I think that it's an opportunity for everyone in the room who's a publisher to talk to Research for Life and think about new ways of delivering our content, delivering them in a more efficient way, so that, until we get to a place where, the global flip happens and everything is open, that we can actually get our, final version of record in front of researchers around the world.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you for that. I want to, first of all, thank all of you for participating today, for joining us in this session. I would like to thank all of our presenters, all of our speakers, Craig, Dan, Peter, Michael, Hillary, Jason, David, Rachel, and Kathleen. Big round of applause for all the speakers. A few reminders before you bounce out. If you haven't